Okay, so we're going to continue with our conducting cells, which are called neurons. Our neurons, again, they generate and conduct impulses to the central nervous system, and they conduct informations away from the nervous system. So the first thing that we're going to do is going to divide them into their two classes. First, let's talk about their functional classification. Functional classification means that we're going to talk about how they do their job. This basically describes the direction in which they send their impulses. And then we're going to discuss structural classification. Structural classifications of neurons will describe what they look like, how they're made, and what they're shaped like. So for functional, the first function is going to be a sensory neuron. Another name or word for sensory neuron is afferent. Sensory neurons send information from receptors to the central nervous system. And when we say receptors, we mean like the receptors in your eye that interpret vision, or the taste receptors, like your taste buds on your tongue. Then they send that information to your brain, to your spinal cord. The second class will be what's known as an association neuron. And another name for that is an interneuron. And the job of the association or interneuron is simply to connect a sensory neuron to a motor neuron, which I'm trying to find a picture, but I don't see a picture. Oh, here we go. Here's a picture of it. So here's a picture of number one, a sensory neuron. So here are sensory receptors in the finger. So this blue neuron is taking information from the pressure of this pin, and it is, if you look at the black arrows, that's the impulse. The sensory neuron is conducting impulses to the spinal cord and to the brain. Number two, this association neuron, also known as an interneuron, its job is just to serve as a link between neuron number one, and then it'll connect to a motor neuron. So again, the job of this association neuron is just to connect. The third type is going to be a motor neuron or efferent neuron. The job of this neuron is to take messages from the CNS and then send them to an effector. And effectors are going to be muscles and glands. So in our picture, here's our sensory neuron going this way. Impulse goes to the brain and spinal cord. Our interneuron connects them. And then here we have our motor neuron, which is shown in red. You can see the arrows are now going away from the central nervous system, away from the brain and the cord, and to, in this case, it's the skeletal muscles of the hand. So those are the three functional classes of neurons: sensory, association, and motor. Again, that describes the job that they do, how they send their impulses. Structural classification, how they look. The first is going to be unipolar. This describes the number of branches that a cell has from its nerve cell body. So remember, we said that the cell body is where the nucleus is stored in a neuron. So it looks like this. So here's my one branch. There's my one branch. I put the X on it. So this is where the term unipolar comes from. It has one pole or one branch from the nerve cell body. The second structural classification is going to be bipolar. So from the nerve cell body, that area of the neuron that contains the nucleus, there's going to be two branches. I'm going to put X's on where we have the two branches. There's one and there's two. And this is called a bipolar neuron. And then the last structural classification is going to be a multipolar neuron that actually has, and this is how we draw most of our neurons, multipolar. Multipolar has multiple branches from the nerve cell body. So here's one X for a branch. Here's another branch. And these branches are actually called processes. In the case that I'm drawing here, this process is called an axon, and these are called dendrites. Now, axons and dendrites do exist here, but they're not whole structures. They call them axon endings or dendritic endings. But a true to life dendrite is shown here. A true to life elongated axon is shown here on this multipolar neuron. And again, that's multipolar. And that concludes our structural classification of conducting cells called neurons.